All right, so this is my rundown for Fear the Walking Dead episode 809, which is called Sanctuary. Even if you don't watch Fear the Walking Dead that much, this episode might be one that you would appreciate because it's mostly about Dwight and Sherry, and there are a lot of callbacks to season 8 and the Sanctuary, and Daryl even made an appearance, which made me smile, but it was just in flashback. Dwight was having, actually a lot of them, both him and Sherry had a lot of flashbacks to what happened before in the flagship series, and so we just see a couple of flashes of Daryl, nothing huge, and we hear him say to Dwight, you know, go make it right, when he was going to kill Dwight, but then he ended up letting him go so that Dwight could go find Sherry. And there's even one part where Dwight starts talking to Daryl, even though Daryl's not there. Anyway, I'll get to that. So, you know, a little bit of an appearance for Daryl. Now, I will say that even though there are a lot of callbacks that we could point to in this episode, I didn't get huge Team Delusional vibes from it. I didn't get huge Beth vibes. And I will go into some of the things that we see. There are definitely some callbacks we could point to. But overall, this felt like it was much more about Dwight and Sherry. And it's just, I mean, this probably won't be as long a video because I don't have as much to say about this episode. We'll see. I mean, I know I tend to say that and then I go on and on and on, so we'll see. But anyway, overall, it like I said, I just didn't get huge Beth vibes from it. I will talk about a handful of things, but I still really did like the episode. It was a very profound episode, and I think the themes that they were trying to bring across in it, they do apply kind of universally to all the characters in the series, but they're definitely going to apply to Daryl and Beth in a big way too. So I will just point those kinds of things out and how that this might apply to them, and the few callbacks that I did get Beth and Daryl vibes from, especially the last scene with Victor Strand was kind of a big one. So yeah, let's just dive right in. I'm going to do a quick recap of what happened in terms of the plot. So keep in mind, I'm about to go into big spoilers. If you haven't watched it, be warned, I'm going to be talking about spoilers here. So basically the last we saw of Dwight and Sherry, which would have been in the first part of the season of Fear, so it would have been Fear the Walking Dead 8A, you know, the A part of the season, they basically split up. And I thought that was kind of stupid myself because literally they have fought so hard to find each other and so hard to be together, and it's just kind of stupid that they split up. But clearly the writers had something in mind, and even though it's been a while, it feels like a while since they parted ways, for them it really hasn't been that long. I mean, there was the hiatus, and then it's been a few episodes that neither of them have really been in, but it's probably only been a couple of weeks since they've seen each other. It really hasn't been long. So Dwight goes home to his and Sherry's cabin, which is interesting because that's actually pretty close to Alexandria. So he traveled all the way back, and a man shows up in his cabin needing insulin, which is a major callback to Sherry's sister, if you remember, in 606, who was also a diabetic. So if you don't remember that, just a quick recap. That was when Daryl first met up with Dwight and Sherry, and her younger sister Tina, who had massive Beth vibes, was in need of insulin. But at one point, in order to get away from them, they had taken him captive, and he grabbed their bag and ran away, and it wasn't until after that that he realized that the insulin was in there, and he actually took it back to them because he knew she needed her insulin. But this is where Dwight and Sherry kind of betray him and take off, and it's like our first introduction to the Saviors before All Out War happens, and before Negan was actually a part of the show. Anyway, so this is definitely a callback to that, and Dwight gets really upset because he thinks that this is a setup of some kind. I mean, what are the chances that somebody shows up needing insulin when he has a history of family members who also needed insulin? And I'm going to talk about that in just a minute when we get to the end, because even from a viewer point of view, I'm sure there will be some people that say, oh yeah, what are the chances that was such a contrived plot? But I actually disagree. I have some theories about this. You guys know me and my theories, right? Anyway, but I'll get to that. Anyway, so he goes and tries to help this guy get the insulin that he needs, and lo and behold, the group that took it from him is actually staying at the sanctuary. So we have Dwight going back to these places that have haunted him and caused a lot of trauma for him. He does go and find the insulin pretty quickly. He sees an infinity sign. Now, the infinity sign is definitely one we've seen quite often. We've seen it around Dwight and Sherry. We didn't see it specifically around Beth and Daryl, but we have always applied it to them because it's like an eternity symbol. And especially when you see it around couples, you kind of can't help but think of Beth and Daryl. But we also saw it around Alpha, which was interesting, and we saw it on her belt buckle. I mean, in her case, it was like a snake. It was a little bit of Morgan's Ouroboros symbol, but still, it was kind of a combination of things. So we do see it, and to me, that is a really good indication, if you needed proof, that the writers put these things in for meaning, because that symbol it's a symbol for eternity. It's a symbol for things being circular, the circular arcs that feed back on each other and come back around. It's very much a theme that they use in the show a lot. Anyway, so we see those. Dwight ends up throwing a guy into the furnace, which he had to do in order to survive. Like it wasn't like, it was a self-defense tactic, but you can tell that it really disturbed him because he feels like he just became Negan by doing that, So it was fast. They didn't dwell on it a whole lot, but you could see from the look on his face that it really disturbed him. Then he takes off and he goes back to his cabin where this man, whose name was Jay, is waiting for his insulin. And it's really kind of sad when you watch it because Dwight's really happy when he gets there and he's smiling and laughing, even though he's hurt. Somebody shot at him and it grazed the outside of his arm, so he's not hurt badly, but he's hurt, but he's smiling and he's going, "Hey man, I got it." And when he gets there, Jay is already dead. And at first I wasn't sure if somebody came and killed him, but it looks like he just didn't get his insulin in time. And so he ended up expiring. So it feels like a rehash of everything that's always happened to Dwight. He feels like every time he tries to save someone, they die anyway. He wasn't able to save Tina back in the day. In order to save him, Sherry ended up being one of Negan's wives, which really, really messed up their relationship, Dwight and Sherry's, And then he tried to save Finch. So a part of their backstory, again, if you haven't watched the first half of the season, is that Dwight and Sherry did have a son who was, they did a time jump. He was about 8 years old, I think, 7 or 8 years old, and he died. They were not able to save him, and they had to bury him together. It was super, super tragic. So that's part of why they broke up. They're both really heavily grieving their son. The loss of a child is about the worst thing a parent can go through. And he wasn't able to save his son, and then he comes back and he was not able to save this Jay guy. So he's just in a very dark place. He feels like no matter what he does, he can't save anybody. Anyway, so then Sherry and June and Dove come to try and get him to come back with them and help fight Troy and save Padre, but he doesn't want to, and he totally says that that's why, because anything he touches, he feels like people die, and he's just not going to do that. So he's absolutely refusing to go back with them under any circumstance. Then the next morning, the same people that he took the insulin from, who are now hunting him, they try to steal the truck, and Dove stops them, but she gets shot. So now we have another child. She's a young lady who is in need of medical attention and looks like she might die. We also have June, she's the doctor. She was actually a nurse, but she's kind of become the doctor on the show. And she's refusing to basically give anyone medical treatment because she's lost her faith in herself. And she, kind of the same thing. She feels like, especially with children, she hasn't been able to save them. Now, I've said before many times that Jenna Elfman in this reminds me a lot of Carol. And it's not so much her arc, but sometimes just the way she talks. She sounds like Melissa McBride to me. Now, June, especially, she had a romance with a guy who was on the show, and everyone was way ticked off when they killed him off, but it turns out the actor actually wanted to leave the show. I don't think that the writers wanted him to leave. But she has definitely the two of them were definitely Beth and Daryl proxies lots of times on the show. But there's a lot of June that also reminds me of Carol. And this was one of those times. She lost a child, and she feels like children are dying all around her, and that just really gave me Carol vibes. So she doesn't really want to take the bullet out of Dove. She wants to help her, but she just doesn't trust herself to do it. Meanwhile, they go back to the sanctuary in order to get the medical supplies that Dove needs, and a lot of it takes place there. The sanctuary is falling down around them. We see Dwight go back to his old room, which is a place that Daryl spent some time. So like I said, there's a lot of callbacks that we could potentially look at and say, that's like a Beth callback. But at the same time, in this episode, it just didn't feel to me like they were necessarily trying to go there. The first time around, in season 8, we saw so much Beth symbolism around the sanctuary and around Dwight and Sherry and around Daryl and Dwight and all of that. While Daryl was there in the episode called The Cell, all kinds of stuff. And so it feels like this should feel like it's invoking Beth because it's calling back to all that stuff. But in this episode, I just didn't get that vibe. I think it was much more just about what's going on in the present and Dwight and Sherry. However, as I said, I'm getting there. The themes will apply universally too. So while they're there, I'll try to go a little faster here. Sherry ends up locking Dwight in his room to go take care of walkers, but then she gets herself into trouble, and June goes and lets him out, and he goes and helps Sherry, and then they run back in, and the guys who are basically the villains in this episode who are trying to kill Dwight come back, and there's a big showdown, and there's walkers, and like I said, the building's coming down around them, and several times throughout the episode, Dwight looks at the furnace. Now, this is partly because he threw the guy in the furnace at the beginning, right? But it's also because Negan did that, which traumatized him. And also, Negan is the one who burnt Dwight's face with an iron. So there's a lot of trauma for him around that furnace. And you can tell he's kind of haunted by it. He keeps looking at it and having issues with it, right? Well, at the end, there's not actually a fire going on in the furnace right then, but the building's coming down around them, and there's lots of walkers, and so they all basically get in the furnace just to be safe, just to have a safe place to go so they don't get eaten or have rocks falling on them that are, falling out of the roof of the sanctuary or anything. And then Dwight says, well, we're pretty safe in here. Let's just do the surgery in here. And he kind of comes around that maybe he does need to try a little harder. He does need to help with Padre. He encourages June to do the surgery, which she does, and it's successful. And at the end, Dwight basically says that he recognizes that he ran away, but he's going to go back and help them with Padre. Okay, so that's the basic gist of it. But there were a couple of themes, and I picked up partially on it when I was watching it, and I was like, ooh, that's good. I really like that. But then they always do an inside the episode at the end where the showrunners kind of explain some things, and that's what I was glad that they explained it, because it made even more sense when they explained it. So the thing I picked up on as the theme of the show is there's a part where Dove she's the girl that was shot, and she's yelling at June, and she says that people like June and this group are not going to be able to help them, meaning any of the kids at Padre or save Padre. And the reason for that, she says, is because people who can't get over their own shit always let them down. And I thought that was a really interesting theme, because it's kind of true. You always hear people say cliche things like, you got to help yourself before you can help anyone else. If you're on a plane, you got to put your own oxygen mask on before you can help other people. And it's true. It's just reality. And so people who have their own hangups and are really in a dark place emotionally, they have a hard time helping other people. They really can't, So I thought that was an interesting theme. And then at the end, the showrunner talked about how it was the furnace that first traumatized Dwight. It's like a symbol of all of Dwight's trauma from back at the sanctuary, from Negan, from everything with him and Sherry, all of that. And then that ends up being what saves them. So what the showrunner said is that you have to kind of push through the ashes of your trauma together and then build on that to make yourself strong. And that's what they did. But I also think it was really interesting that it may be actually the thing that traumatized you, the thing that was traumatic, that will end up being the thing that saves you. And I really, really think that's going to be a huge theme with Beth and Daryl. So, okay, so let's talk about a couple of things that I did see as callbacks that I think are important to note. All the way back last week, one of my fellow theorists pointed out from the preview of this episode that we see a Home Sweet Home reference. When Dwight first goes back to his and Sherry's cabin, there's a doormat right in front of the front door that says Home Sweet Home, which is pretty typical. And at one point, he kind of passes out and he falls back and lays down on it. So you can see the Home Sweet Home sort of framing his head. Now, we've always associated that with Beth and Daryl, because in Still, Daryl says that when they're in the Moonshine Shack and they decide to, wait in there and wait for that walker to pass. She gives him a jar of moonshine, and he sits down and says Home Sweet Home, right? So we've always seen that as something that applies to them. Well, I think there's two different ways that they were calling back to it as a theme in this episode with Dwight and Sherry. The first is it has everything to do with them being a couple. We talk about how home in the show is where your family is. And Dwight was away from his family, but then they came to get him. So it was a kind of a mini reunion, not like a huge deal, because like I said, it hasn't been that long since they've seen each other. But he was alone, and then his family shows up. So part of it is being, quote unquote, at home with his family. Also going through kind of a trauma together, I think, is part of it. But I also think that it calls back to, what the showrunner said. He talked about Dwight and Sherry and how they have to push through this trauma together as a couple and figure it out, basically, because as a couple, they're a mess right now. They have not worked through their past trauma. They have not let go of, as Dove said, they have not gotten over their shit and figured things out so that they can help other people. And that's something that they have to work through together and come out on the other side and become stronger. And that is exactly what Beth and Daryl did in Still. Okay, they were both going through the trauma of the prison. They were both doing their own things, being kind of dark and destructive, and at least on Daryl's side, not letting people in, not working through his crap, right? And they together had to work through their feelings and their emotions and work through that trauma and come out stronger on the other side. So I think that that's why we have that Home Sweet Home reference as well. And so we can kind of use that as a template. Anytime we see it, we're going to probably see something like this with whatever characters are being showcased in the episode, right? But I just have to go back and put a little bit of a finer point on the fact that Dwight and Sherry are a couple. There's no bones about it. They are a romantic couple. They've been married for a long time. They even had a kid together. So I know I'm preaching to the choir here. Anyone listening to this is obviously on board with Beth and Daryl as a couple and knows that that's exactly what the writers were trying to tell us. But this is kind of proof of it, right? The fact that they had this Home Sweet Home reference and then they had to go through this trauma together. Even though they weren't a canon couple at the time, it was very much a romantic couples dynamic. And it was the same dynamic that we see in this episode with Dwight and Sherry, just a couple who is getting through their trauma so that they can come out stronger together on the other side. So that was one of the biggest things that I saw in terms of calling back to Beth and Daryl, and I really, really liked that about this episode. And I really liked the theme that it is your trauma that might make you stronger. Now, let me talk about that a little bit more with Beth. I have talked many, many times about how something about the way things played out in season 5, her being shot, her being left behind, the group thinking she's dead, even though that caused a lot of trauma and a lot of heartache, something about that is going to end up saving everybody. Okay, it's going to end up being necessary, which is why in 509, which was Tyrese's death episode, we had the theme, it went the way it had to, the way it was always going to, because it had to be that way, and I think it's going to have to do with the CRM war. You know, if it hadn't happened that way, then Team Family would not win the CRM war, and they would basically be doomed, right? But because it happened that way, it will help them win the war eventually. And obviously, we haven't gotten there yet, and there's a lot of evidence for that being the case in 509, which is why I want to go back and revisit that episode and do a video about it. But I think that this theme about your trauma making you stronger and that it's specifically going to be the thing that traumatized you that will save you, I think that it's kind of a variation on that same theme, right? What happened in season 5, it made everyone stronger. The ones who, well, let's put it this way, either the people who came out of that died soon after because it didn't make them stronger. Therefore, people like Noah, for example, or you could say Tyrese, and I'm not at all throwing shade at either of those characters. It's just kind of the way things played out. For everyone else, they went through periods where they were very in a dark place. They were very hard emotionally and not in a good way, right? But they worked through it, and it made them stronger overall. And that's certainly true of Daryl. And I think it's especially true from a Daryl's perspective as we left him at the end of the Daryl Dixon season 1, because he had this trauma of his grandfather having died in France. And I don't know if I ever talked about it again, but originally I said that I thought him crying at the end when he saw his grandfather's grave was him accepting it and then wanting to get home. But Norman gave an interview where it was kind of actually the opposite as the way I interpreted it, and that is that he was still really upset about it. Like, the way that they meant for that scene to play out was not that he accepted it, but that he was still really sad and angry and resentful about it, and that's why he suddenly decided he was going home, because he didn't want to become his grandfather and die in France and never see his family again. But he was still angry about it, right? But I think something about that, I mean, Laurent showing up and keeping him in France is something that will make him stronger, that will have him run into Beth, and that will ultimately save him. So, like I said, even though this episode didn't give me huge Beth vibes, the themes that are in them, I feel like, are going to be really, really big for Beth and Daryl, and that they're universal to the show. So I really did like the episode, and I really liked it for, you know, even just the stuff around Dwight and Sherry. I thought it was very profound, and I'm glad that they're back together now. And I like Dwight and Sherry, you know, I'm totally rooting for them. So apparently they're going back to try and help fight against Troy and save Padre, and we'll see where they end up. There's only 3 episodes left of this entire series, but I do think most of the characters will probably survive, and that we'll see them in other parts of the TWD universe. Okay, there was one shot that did really jump out at me, and it's this shot after Dove is shot in the stomach, and we see a bullet hole in her windshield. Okay, so this actually goes back to 509. There is a scene in 509 which we believed was symbolic of Beth. So it wasn't even necessarily a shot that Beth was in, but that Emily was in. But when they get to Noah's home, there is a wreck of cars, and we see a bullet hole in the windshield. And it's one of these things that it's focused on several times even before we see what's going on. So in 509, they do this montage at the beginning where we see all of these different shots, and we don't really know what they are. And then we kind of see them as the episode proceeds and understand what they are. One of them is a bullet in the windshield. And in that car where there's a bullet in the windshield, there is a walker that has woken up, and it looks like a female. It looks like it's got blonde hair, and even the silhouette of its sweater looks like the sweater Beth was wearing when she got shot. So we believe, especially because we believe Beth might have been left behind in a car, we believe that that represents her waking up in the car. Now, obviously, literally in the episode, that is not Beth. It is actually a walker, and they don't even put it down because it's inside the car. They just kind of look at it and walk by it. But it's symbolically representative of Beth waking up in a car, right, and actually living. And the bullet hole in the windshield, I believe it represents not only her waking up, but I believe it actually represents her getting shot in the head. As if a person were a car, the windshield would be their head, kind of. So it represents getting shot, in the forehead. And the reason I believe that actually goes back to 416. Okay, so it's just, I know it's a little bit convoluted, but it just goes to show that they have used the same thing over and over and over again. And maybe sometime this week, maybe tomorrow, I'll go through, take you through the whole sequence so you can see it. But anyway, there's a part in 416 where Carl wakes up in the blue Suburban, and it's kind of the same deal. Anyway, so we believed that bullet in the windshield, especially the way that it was focused on in 509, represented Beth being shot, but then waking up afterward. So we have that exact same thing going on here, or at least pretty similar. When Dove is hurt, she shows up in the car, and they show us a really quick shot of a bullet hole in the windshield, and it looks exactly like the one from 509. So you could also argue then that we have a young woman who is shot here, and granted, she was shot in the abdomen, not the head, so it's a little bit different, but when she pulls up, she was driving, so she was clearly conscious, but her head is down, and it's almost like she wakes up in the car. And then, she's hurt pretty bad. They have to take her to a place to get medical treatment. For Beth, that probably would have been Grady. Here it's the sanctuary, and she really should have died, but she lived. So you can kind of see a little bit of a parallel between Beth and Dove there. Meanwhile, we've got this whole romance vibe going on with Dwight and Sherry. And that's another thing that they do that I don't always talk about, where, you can say, okay, well, maybe Dwight and Sherry are a parallel to Beth and Daryl, which is, what I said, the home sweet home thing and going through the trauma together. Meanwhile, they're coupling it with another plot line in which this young woman is shot and needs medical care and should die but doesn't. And both of those things simultaneously represent different parts of Beth's arc. And they're doing them at the same time using these other characters. And we've seen them do that a lot in episodes. You'll have like the main plot and then the subplot, and they both relate to Beth and Daryl's story on some level. So you can kind of see them doing that here too. Now, overall, like I said, I didn't get huge Beth vibes from this, but WDA actually did say something that was really interesting, and it made me kind of think of things a little bit differently, and that is just that there's really big 509 vibes here. So I already talked about the windshield thing, but also that Dwight went back to his home, which was not a terribly maybe necessary part of the plot. Like, could they not have worked through this trauma of theirs over losing their son where they were? Why did he have to come all the way back to his home? But it kind of mirrors taking Noah home to his home in Shirewilt. And just that there might have been a lot more 509 vibes that I wasn't really thinking about and picking up on. If that is the case, and that's what they were going for, and because of the bullet in the windshield, I think it probably was, then this is interesting. This is interesting that it might be a foreshadow of Beth's return. I also think that it could be a foreshadow of the way in which Dwight and Sherry's story may interact with Beth's. And that is probably going to be through the CRM, but it might also be through Padre. I really do think Dwight and Sherry will go back and, save Padre from Troy or whatever. I don't know if they'll stay there. They could just end up taking everyone with them and then going back to Alexandria or something. But if they were to stay there, chances are they're going to end up running into the CRM at some point. So it also could have something to do with that. So it'll be interesting to see how things progress in their story and how they leave it at the end of Fear the Walking Dead as a series before they kind of transition them back into the main narrative, whatever that ends up being. So lots of interesting things to think about, but it's a little bit up in the air for me right now. I'm just not sure exactly which way to go on it, but I'm sure it will make more sense as we continue on. So the last thing I want to talk about is the final scene of this episode, and it's the only one that gave me really, really heavy Beth vibes in terms of kind of the tone of it and the background symbolism. So basically we see someone setting up a room, and it's mostly concrete. It looks like a cell. And we see just a lot of things that could be Beth symbols in the background. There are some clothing that's being hung up on a rack, and some of it was red. So it really, what this reminded me of was Beth's cell at the prison and what we see in 401. Remember, there's that red garment behind her. There was kind of some callbacks to that. There were some green shelves. There is a record playing. I did notice that I haven't looked up the song yet, but the lyrics on the song said something about sailing away to Spain, which obviously Daryl is not in Spain, he's in France, but there's talk about him going to other places in Europe. So that was maybe a kind of a nod to the fact that Daryl's in Europe right now. I also noticed a pink butterfly. Butterflies aren't something we saw specifically around Beth in the show, but they're kind of an inherent symbol of resurrection. The butterfly goes to sleep for a while, and when they come out, they're transformed into something new and beautiful. And so obviously, that's just kind of inherently a transformation or resurrection symbol. And we did see them back at the prison in the chalk mural, and we've seen them in a few other places. And it's pink, which is the music box color, so we always say pink is a Beth thing. The other thing is the record player. So obviously, records are a Beth thing. The song, the fact that there's singing going on, again, it's kind of like her cell. Even though we didn't see her playing music in her cell, there was music, written music, like up on the walls and that sort of thing. And I was wondering about the song that is played here, but I actually did find it. It's called Run and Catch the Wind. And it actually has some lyrics that I feel like really suggest Beth. Okay, so it says, count the drops in a stream, run and catch the wind, sail to Spain on a dream, run and catch the wind. So I feel like that could be a nod to Daryl being in Europe. And then it says, kick a stone down the road. That reminds me both of the green jasper stone that he found in 4A, but also he told Beth to meet him down the road when they split up at the funeral home. And we feel like that is also a symbolic thing that they, split up, but they're going to meet again down the road. Let's see, what else have we got? Think of something big to do, run and catch the wind. Someone else will follow you, run and catch the wind. So it feels like, Daryl's following her or he's going to find her. Make a fan of butterfly wing, run and catch the wind. Listen to what I sing, run and catch the wind. So again, it's just, they're singing. The lyrics feel like they're kind of evoking Beth as well. So those are just some more details from this last scene. And I also noticed that the record is green in color. So like I said, definitely some Beth vibes going on there. Anyway, so just lots of Beth symbolism in this, and it feels like her cell. And what it ends up being is that Strand is setting up this cell, and they have found Troy's daughter, I'm assuming it's Troy's daughter, Tracy. She's very young. She's like 8 years old, and the poor kid is obviously scared out of her mind, felt so bad for her. They're traumatizing her just bringing her there, but they have her blindfolded, and they've taken her captive, and Strand is nice to her. He's not being a jerk or anything here other than the fact that they're taking her captive. But he takes off her blindfold and he just says, you're going to help me save Padre. And I'm thinking what he has in mind is sort of a prisoner exchange sort of thing. Like they have Troy's daughter, they'll give her back, but he's got to, relinquish this I'm going to take over Padre mission of his. But you can see why this has a lot of Beth vibes to it. For one thing, she's being brought here as a prisoner. Strand, you could see Strand having some Dawn vibes for sure. I mean, I said before that in season 7, he set up a community at a tower that he was the head of, and that tower had so many Grady vibes. I mean, it was ridiculous, the amount of symbolism there, but he was not the best leader, like as in he wasn't 100% good. He was picking and choosing who came in. He was killing people if he thought they were a threat to his community. He was really kind of embracing his dark side. And I think Strand does have a good heart, but he's somebody who very much straddles the line between good and evil. So you can definitely see him having Dawn vibes when it comes to leadership. And so you could see this as kind of a parallel to Grady, to Beth being brought to Grady. And I think it's even interesting that Tracy seemed to, she was blindfolded when they brought her in, which suggests obviously blindness, but, some sort of eye and sight symbolism, which we could tie to the Sirius symbolism. And like I said, at some point we might be doing some sort of prisoner exchange, which would definitely be a callback to Grady. So again, this episode overall, I liked it. It didn't have a whole lot of Beth vibes other than a few things here and there, but that last end scene had a lot more. And it is kind of kicking us into what's going to happen next. I think the last 3 episodes of both the season and the series will be about them fighting Troy for Padre, and we might get a lot of Beth and Grady vibes there. Yeah, I think that's most of what I have to say right now. I'm sure people will bring things up throughout the week and I can post them. I will still do some ask videos throughout the week as we go. And yeah, I would actually encourage everyone to watch this episode because I truly did like it. It's actually very, very profound. Just don't expect too much, team delusional truth bombs or anything like that. And, you get to see Daryl for a minute, so it's all good. So anyway, feel free to send in your questions or anything you want me to talk about or anything you want me to make a video about, and I will be back tomorrow with the next video. Bye!